Cool. Right, so today we want to do the blood. When I was a student, I learnt it was a red viscous fluid, but we now know it's a red fluid contained in the vascular department, in the vascular compartment. Remember when we did the different compartments, didn't we? So blood should be in the intravascular compartment. If it's not, we'd call that a hemorrhage, wouldn't we? It's not supposed to leak out. But today we want to notice that blood is composed of cells and plasma. And normally it's around about 45% cells and about 55% plasma. And the plasma, of course, is the liquid part in which the cells float. And the plasma is mostly made up of water. Apparently it's about 91.5% water. So the water in the intravascular compartment is in the plasma. Now remember when we looked at blood, we learnt about the osmotic pressure in blood and things like that. What was it that generated the osmotic pressure in the blood primarily? It was the proteins, wasn't it? So there are plasma proteins. And you might remember there's albumin, globulin, actually globulins, because the globulins are the immune proteins, lots of different sorts. There's another protein called fibrinogen. And fibrinogen is one of the clotting proteins. When the blood clots, the fibrinogen is converted to fibrin. Also in the plasma you're going to have nutrients because it's going to carry nutrients around the body. You're all being very well behaved this morning. You can breathe and talk. So nutrients such as
oxygen.
No, we'll count that under gases. But seeing you mentioned it, we'll do that one now. So gases, yes, there is a little bit of oxygen carried in the plasma, not much. Maybe only 1% or 1.5% of the total. The vast majority of the oxygen, of course, is carried in the hemoglobin, isn't it? In the red blood cells. So there's a little bit. And there's also a little bit of carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma also. So yes, it does carry some gases. What was the main nutrient in the blood we looked at last week?
Glucose.
Yep. And of course, any nutrient that goes from the gut to the tissues of the body has to be carried in the blood. It's not going to get there any other way, so you might think of amino acids. You might think of vitamins. And also, nutrients can be carried around the body in, or fatty material can be carried around the body in cholesterol. Carrier molecules for fats. Have you learned the two types of cholesterol? Yeah. High density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins. Now if you live in England, which one do you want to be high? Hmm?
Is it the high? HDL?
What do you think? Hmm? You would like high LDL, would you? Who fancies high LDL? Who fancies high HDL? We've got an entire class of abstainers. I fancy, although I haven't got, unfortunately, high HDL. HDL is the good one. H for helpful, H for healthy. LDL is the bad one. So this one tends to clean your arteries up, and this one tends to clog your arteries up. HDL moves fat from the blood to the liver, which is good. But LDL takes fat from the liver and other places and dumps it in the blood. And we end up with too much. Oh, thought of something else. What else is in the plasma? No, we're going to do that under cells. But you're absolutely right, there are platelets. Wouldn't get far without those, would we? Electrolytes. So we've got sodium, potassium, chloride, other trace electrolytes. So we've thought of electrolytes, water, proteins, nutrients, gases. Oh, thought of another one. Anyone think of another one?
What does the L stand for on the last one again?
Low density lipoprotein. Yeah. Do you bring shopping into your house? Yeah? And what do you do with all the packaging and all the bits you don't eat? Do you keep it? Goes in recycling, doesn't it? Or in the dustbin. So can you see we need to transport waste as well? Does that make sense? So that transports waste products. Urea would be a good example. Urea is produced in the liver to excrete waste nitrogen. Circulates in the blood and is excreted into the urine by the kidneys. Right, electrolytes, water, protein, nutrients, gases, wastes, all sorts of stuff in the plasma. So I guess if it's 91%, plasma's 91% water, all these other things must be about 8.5% of the plasma. And the vast majority of that volume is actually taken up by the proteins. And that's important because it's the difference between the concentration of the proteins in the intravascular and the interstitial compartments which generate the osmotic pressure that sucks the tissue fluid back into the capillaries. Remember, we memorised that about 2-3 weeks ago now. Good. I'll do for plasma, I think. Is that okay? All right, for plasma. That. Probably something we've missed, but never mind. Now the cells aren't that hard, it's just that they tend to have difficult names. So the first lot of cells we want to talk about are granular. Granulocytes. Now all the blood cells were named in the days of light microscopes. So a lot of the names of the cells describe their appearance using a light microscope. And the granulocytes were so named because they had granules in their cytoplasm. So all the granulocytes appear to have granules in their cytoplasm. And the most abundant form of the granulocytes is the neutrophils. Neutrophils. These are actually the most common type of cell in the blood. Now, the neutrophils are larger than the red blood cells, and they have a segmented nucleus. And actually, as they grow older, they get more segments in their nucleus, connected together by thin strands. So you might see some with 3 segments, or you might see other cells with 4 or even 5 segments in their nucleus. So a very strange shaped nucleus. It's in several lobes. And then throughout the cytoplasm there are smallish granules, but granules nevertheless. And these are the most common type of white cell in the blood. So we're considering white cells just now. Neutrophils. What's the other name for white blood cells? Talk louder. No, they're the red ones. We haven't done those yet. Huh? Leukocytes. Leukocytes. Some people spell it with a K, but the English way is with a C. So leukocytes are all the white blood cells. So what we're actually talking about just now is granulocytic leukocytes. It's a type of leukocyte. And neutrophils are particularly important at combating bacterial infection. Bacterial infection. So if you have a bacterial infection, the number of neutrophils in the blood will go up to combat that bacterial infection. Or if you have a wound, over the first 24 hours that wound has formed, the number of neutrophils in the wound will greatly increase because they combat bacterial infection. And because there's a lot of them, they can spring into action quickly, combating bacterial infection. Now there's another sort of granulocyte. Eosinophil or eosinophils. Eosinophils. And the eosinophils tend to have 2 main lobes in their nucleus. But joined together by quite a thick strand of chromatin that holds the 2 lobes of the nucleus together. That will be an eosinophil. Eosinophils. And these have larger granules in their nucleus. Now the granules in the nucleus of the neutrophil contain chemicals to attack bacteria. And the granules in the nucleus of the eosinophils contain granules that particularly attack parasitic infections. So these attack parasitic infections. If you had some sort of worms growing in your lungs or in your gut or in your tissues, the amount of eosinophils in the blood would go up to combat that infection. So eosinophils are also granulocytic leukocytes. They're white blood cells that contain granules. Now there's a third sort of granulocyte, and the third sort are called basophils. Basophils. And basophils, they do have a sort of a horseshoe-shaped nucleus, sort of like that. So it's basically a two-lobe nucleus that's joined together in a basophil. Very strange nuclei, these granulocytes, haven't they? But if you actually look at a basophil under a light microscope, you can't see it because you can't see the nucleus because there's so many huge granules all over the place. So basophils have huge granules. Now you don't get many basophils in the blood, but what the basophils do is they migrate into the tissues. And in the tissues they're called mast cells. So the basophils migrate into the tissues where we call them mast cells. And one of the things that the granules contained inside these granules, is a substance called histamine. And one of the things histamine does is it brings about local inflammatory reactions. Local inflammatory reactions. So we know that that causes the characteristics of inflammation, which you know now, don't you? Heat, pain, redness, swelling, and loss of function. The characteristics of inflammation. So far we've seen that there's blood made of cells and plasma. We've seen that the white cells in the blood are called leukocytes. We've seen that one classification of leukocytes is called granulocytes. We've seen that the granulocytes are the neutrophils, eosinophils and basophils. Come to think of it, they all end in "phil", don't they? You notice that? So all the granulocytes end in "phil". So the neutrophils, eosinophils and basophils are granulocytic white blood cells, therefore they are granulocytic leukocytes. This one's good at fighting bacteria, this one's good at fighting parasites, this one generates inflammatory reactions in the tissues. So they've all kind of got different jobs, but it all sounds quite useful to me. Does it sound quite useful to you? And the most abundant form are the neutrophils. And can you see that this many shapes in its nucleus. So sometimes people call these polymorphonuclear cells, which of course is quite annoying, but
The neutrophils are sometimes called.
well, all of the granulocytes really, but most of the neutrophils, because these are by far the most abundant type of granulocyte. So poly means many. Morph. What does morph mean? It could mean morphine, but it doesn't in this context. What's morphology? What?
Is it the shape?
Yeah, well done. Morph means shape. And nuclear, of course, relates to the nucleus. So can you see they've got many shaped nucleus? Makes sense, doesn't it? So when people are talking about polymorphs, as they do, they're talking about granulocytic leukocytes. Polymorphonucleocytes. Once you've learned the names, it's not so bad. So white cells are leukocytes, granulocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. These are the polymorphonuclear cells. Very important in combating ranges of infections and generating inflammatory responses. Is that okay? Good. So we know that the white cells or the leukocytes can be granulocytes. Alternatively, they can be granulocytes. A means absent or without. So when people looked at these cells in the light microscope, they thought, oh, these ones have granules, but these ones don't.
It's still white cells though.
Absolutely. Yeah. These are a type of leukocyte. The white cells are the leukocytes. So white cells or leukocytes may be granulocytes, or they may be agranulocytes. Now, people have discovered electron micrographs and electron microscopes and have found granules in these cells now. But when you look at it with a light microscope, you don't really see them. And that's where the name comes from. So, cells without granules. So you might have heard of monocytes. Monocytes. These have one largish nucleus. So there's the cell, and the nucleus is normally large and horseshoe shaped like this. With a light microscope, you don't really discern granules in a monocyte. With an electron microscope, you do. They do actually have granules, but we'll keep it quiet. So the monocytes, agranulocytic leukocytes. They're white cells, therefore they're leukocytes, but they don't have obvious granules with a light microscope, so they're agranulocytic leukocytes. White cells without obvious granules. Our monocytes are large cells, and they too can move into the tissues. And when they move into the tissues, they change their name from monocytes to macrophages. And monocytes are the ultimate bacteria eaters. They will gobble up bacteria at a huge rate using the process of cell eating, which is?
Phagocytosis.
Do you remember that one? Phagocytosis. Cell eating. They're very good at phagocytosis. They eat. And they become absolutely colossal in the tissues because they eat so many bacteria and dead tissue cells. They become positively huge. Great big macrophages going around in the tissues, scavenging any bacteria that they come across. And again, in older wounds, after about 48 hours, you start getting a lot of macrophages in wounds. It takes them a while to get going, but once they get going, you get a lot of macrophages in established wounds. And they will eat all this stuff up. Monocytes. And also we now know that monocytes can differentiate in the tissues into cells called dendritic cells. Dendritic cells. And dendritic cells have lots of like extensions. They're like an octopus. Lots of dendrites coming out of them. Bit of a strange shape for a cell, isn't it?
Where do the dendritic cells come?
They're in the tissues. For example, there's quite a lot of dendritic cells in the skin, and they've got their arms sort of sticking out all over the place. But that's good, because if a bacteria comes into contact with this cell anywhere, because their arms are all over the place, they're likely to come into contact with any potential viruses or bacteria. They can recognise the presence of infection. So these are kind of antigen recognising cells. If any infection's there, they're likely to detect it. And then remember the lymph nodes we talked about the other week. These cells will trot off to the lymph nodes and inform the immune system that an infection has arrived. In that context, they're called antigen presenting cells. They present antigens. That is, anything the body recognises as being foreign to the immune system. And other cells in the immune system will then make these immune proteins, the antibodies. So that's monocytes. In the blood they're called monocytes. In the tissues they become macrophages and dendritic cells. Now also included in a granulocytes we can have the thrombocytes. Or the platelets. And these are just relatively small cell fragments. So the thrombocytes or the platelets are small cell fragments floating around in the plasma. And the cell they derive from, we don't find in the blood, but it lives in the bone marrow. And the cell they derive from is called a megakaryocyte, which are positively huge cells, absolutely colossal. So in the bone marrow we have cells called megakaryocytes, huge cells. And these break up into a couple of thousand smaller fragments called thrombocytes that then circulate in the blood. So the megakaryocytes are only in the bone marrow, but they produce the platelets which circulate in the plasma in the blood. And the thrombocytes are absolutely essential for blood clotting. The thrombocytes facilitate blood clotting. If you take aspirin to reduce the coagulability of your blood, it's the aspirin that's affecting the platelets, it's affecting the thrombocytes, making them less likely to initiate coagulation. So you know a lot of patients are on 70 milligrams of aspirin a day. That's why. It makes these less likely to activate, less likely to stick together. So hopefully we won't get any blood clots that we don't want. The downside, of course, is it makes you bleed for longer if you take aspirin. And it does. I took some once, took some aspirin. I thought it was a good idea for some strange reason a few years ago. And if you cut yourself shaving, it like dribbles for hours. You know, it's really noticeable that your blood doesn't clot up as much when you take aspirin, because you've inhibited the effect of the thrombocytes. So can you see monocytes are agranulocytic leukocytes. We've included thrombocytes as agranulocytic leukocytes. They're still leukocytes, they're still white cells, but they're agranulocytic. Now there's another sort of agranulocytic cells called lymphocytes. 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 And there's two sorts of lymphocytes. Lymphocytes can be big or small. So the small ones are pretty small, usually about the same size as a red blood cell, but the big ones are bigger than the small ones. Hence the name. Now the small ones tend to have a very large nucleus in comparison to the size of the cell. So a small lymphocyte would look something like that, a very large nucleus in proportion to the overall size of the cell. The big lymphocytes also have a biggish nucleus, but not as big. In proportion to the cell as the small lymphocytes. So that's a big one, that's a big lymphocyte, that's a small lymphocyte. Now, these are both immune cells, because that's what white cells do, isn't it? They combat infection. We've noticed different white cells combating infection in different ways. But the big ones are the NKs. That stands for natural killers. So the big lymphocytes are natural killers, NKs. And that's what they do. They kill. They are great killers. And they normally kill cells. They are cell killers. But they're very clever because they can recognise cells which are infected with viruses. And they kill the cells that are infected with viruses. But they don't kill it one virus at a time, they just take out the whole cell. think nothing of it. They kill the whole cell. But that's good, because if you kill the cells with viruses in it, can you see you're going to kill the viruses? Stop the viruses from spreading to other cells. So the natural killer cells are a bit like someone in the SAS or something who finds a house full of terrorists. And instead of shooting the individual terrorist, he just chucks a hand grenade in and blows the lot up all at the same time. Blows the house up, but it kills everyone inside it. That's what the NKs do. And they act in a fairly non-specific way. Pretty well any viral infection, they'll kill the cell. Because remember, viruses are intracellular parasites, aren't they? Viruses can only divide inside other body cells. That's the only way they can get along. So they're the big ones. But the small ones are a bit more complicated. The small ones, there's two sorts of small ones. Some are called B and some are called T. So you get B small lymphocytes and you get T type small lymphocytes. Both agranulocytic leukocytes. Now the B cells are seriously useful because if there's an infection, the B cells divide thousands of times and produce masses of B-type cells that produce the antibodies. And these are called the plasma cells. So normally in the blood, yes, you're going to have B lymphocytes, but if there's an infection, these are going to proliferate and make huge amounts of plasma cells. And that's good because it's the plasma cells that produce the antibodies. Antibodies, of course, are the immune proteins. The immunoglobulins, the immune proteins that fight the infection. And particularly, because they make antibodies, the lymphocytes are particularly good at fighting viral infections. So when you have a viral infection, it's the number of lymphocytes that tends to rise. So bacterial infection, it's the neutrophils that tend to rise. And chronic bacterial infections, it's the monocytes that tend to rise. But viral infection, it's the lymphocytes that tends to rise in number. Because the lymphocytes are good at fighting viral infections. Now the T lymphocytes are themselves subdivided. There's three types of T cell. There's T helper cells, T suppressor cells, and T cytotoxic cells. So T helper cells, T suppressor cells, T cytotoxic cells. Now the helper cells help the B cells or the plasma cells to produce antibodies. So the helper cells stimulate the B cells to produce antibodies. The suppressor cells tell the immune system when it's time to stop producing antibodies. The suppressor cells limit the immune response. And when someone has HIV infection, human immunodeficiency virus, the cell that the HIV virus actually infects is the T helper cell. So the T helper cell is the site of HIV infection. So in HIV, the HIV virus kills the helper cells. That means the helper cells can no longer help the B cells to produce the antibodies. And if you can't produce the antibodies, what can't you combat? You can't combat the infection. That's why you can develop an acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And the last sort are the cytotoxic lymphocytes. And they can kill cancer cells. The cytotoxic cells can kill cancer cells. As indeed sometimes can the natural killer cells, probably. So if the cytotoxic cells recognise a group of cells as being malignant, they can eradicate those very efficiently. If they don't recognise a group of cancer cells as being malignant, then those cells will proliferate and the patient can develop symptomatic cancer. So the lymphocytes, the monocytes and the thrombocytes are all agranulocytic. They don't have obvious granules in their cytoplasm when viewed with a light microscope, but they are agranulocytic leukocytes because all of these cells we've talked about so far are the white cells, the leukocytes. So the granulocytic leukocytes are the neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. The agranulocytic leukocytes are the thrombocytes, monocytes and lymphocytes. The thrombocytes derive from bone marrow megakaryocytes and are the platelets. The monocytes migrate into the tissues where they can be seen as macrophages and antigen-presenting dendritic cells. The lymphocytes can be big or small. The big lymphocytes are the natural killer cells. The small lymphocytes can be B or T. The B mature in the bone and the T mature in the thymus gland. And the T lymphocytes can be helper cells, suppressor cells, or cytotoxic T lymphocytes. Now, that was the hard bit. Right, do you want to go through that mind map with your next door neighbour now?